The barn had been abandoned for over 40 years, but Ranger wouldn't stop circling it. Dale Morrow had learned, through 3 combat deployments and 11 years operating in places that didn't appear on unclassified maps, that you listen to your dog. You don't ask why. You don't rationalize. You just listen. Ranger had saved his life twice in Kandahar, and once in a narrow alley outside Mosul, where Dale hadn't even registered the threat before the dog's body went rigid. So when Ranger circled that old barn for the 4th time, nose working the air in short, rapid pulls, Dale stopped walking and watched. It was early November, the kind of cold that settles into your joints and stays there. Dale had been living rough for 14 months by then. A sleeping bag, a tarp, a pack with 40 pounds of what he needed to survive, and Ranger. The dog was 8 years old, retired from the military working dog program the same year Dale had separated from the Navy, and they had come home together in the most literal sense of the word. Neither of them had anywhere else to go. He had a name that used to mean something. Staff Warrant Officer Dale Morrow, SEAL Team 3, Commendation Medals, a federal service record that stretched 22 years. He also had a divorce finalized in absentia, a VA system that had lost his disability paperwork twice, a rental apartment he couldn't afford on the partial pay he was receiving, and a drinking problem that had crept up on him so quietly he hadn't noticed it until it had already cost him everything that remained. He'd stopped drinking 8 months ago. Cold. No program, no sponsor, no clinic. Just stopped, because he woke up one morning on a park bench in Baton Rouge, and Ranger was sitting beside him with an expression that Dale could only describe as disappointed, and he couldn't stand it. So they walked. That's mostly what they did. Dale knew how to move through terrain. He knew how to make a camp that kept the rain off, how to stay warm without a fire when a fire was a risk, how to find water and where not to drink it. The skills he'd spent 2 decades honing had turned out to be exactly what his life required now, which struck him sometimes as either deeply ironic or deeply practical, depending on his mood. He had drifted up through Louisiana into Mississippi, then east along the Alabama border, not heading anywhere in particular, just moving the way men do when staying still has become unbearable. He'd found the farm road 3 days earlier while cutting across an overgrown lot. The road led into a stretch of pine and sweet gum that gradually thickened, and somewhere in the middle of all that overgrowth stood what was left of the Halverson property. He'd figured that out from the mailbox, still standing at the road's entrance. The name painted in faded black letters that had mostly peeled away. He wasn't trespassing in any meaningful sense. The land looked as though no one had visited it in a generation. The farmhouse had collapsed on its north side. A rusted harrow sat in the middle of a field that had long since returned to brush, and the barn stood at the edge of what had been a cleared yard, listing slightly to the west, its tin roof spotted with rust but still mostly intact. Ranger circled it again. Dale watched the dog's body language with the attention he'd learned to pay to these things. Ears forward, head low, weight on the front paws. This wasn't prey. Ranger didn't hunt like this. This was something else. Something the dog had been trained to detect, or something older than training, some animal knowledge that didn't have a name. "What is it, boy?" Not a question, more like an acknowledgement. Ranger glanced back at him once, then turned toward the barn's side wall. Dale followed. The wall was old board and batten, the boards silvered with age, some of them warped away from the frame. Ranger stopped at a section near the northwest corner and pressed his nose to the gap between 2 boards. His tail moved, not the happy wag of a dog who'd found a rabbit, but slow, deliberate. The way his tail moved when he was processing something complicated. Dale crouched beside him. He pressed his own face to the gap and looked inside. Dark, a smell that hit him immediately, not decay exactly, but old and enclosed, and something underneath that he couldn't name right away. Damp earth, rust, and something chemical, faint, almost antiseptic, so degraded by time that he nearly missed it. He stood up and moved to the barn door. It was held shut by a length of chain that had been threaded through the door pull and wrapped around a post. The chain was padlocked. The lock was old, but it hadn't rusted through. Someone had locked this barn intentionally, and the padlock was not the kind of thing you put on a building you'd abandoned. Dale pulled a pry bar from his pack. He didn't think twice about it. The hasp gave on the third pull. The door swung outward on hinges that screamed with rust, and the smell hit him full. Earth and age and that chemical undertone, stronger now. Ranger walked in ahead of him, nose working. Dale followed with his flashlight. The barn was mostly empty. A few rusted tools along one wall, the remains of a workbench. But Ranger wasn't interested in any of that. He'd gone to the far corner, the northwest corner, and was standing over a section of the earthen floor, very still. Dale pointed his flashlight at the ground. The earth was different there. Not dramatically. You'd miss it entirely if you weren't looking. But the soil was slightly darker than the surrounding floor, and the texture was different, denser, compacted in a rough rectangular shape, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Dale stood there for a long moment and didn't move. He'd seen disturbed earth before. He'd seen it in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in 2 other countries he still couldn't publicly acknowledge having operated in. He knew what it meant when the ground looked like that, when a patch of soil had been worked and repacked and left to settle, when the dimensions were roughly the size of a human body. Ranger sat down beside it. That was what the dog did when the search was over, when he'd found what he was looking for. Dale took a step back. He sat down on a rotting barrel and stared at the rectangle of packed earth and thought about what he was going to do. He was a homeless veteran with no fixed address and no identification on his person. He'd lost his wallet 3 months ago and hadn't replaced it. If he called the county sheriff's office and reported what he'd found, he would be the first suspect. He had no phone registered in his name, no car, no way to verify who he was. He'd been on this property without permission. He'd broken a padlock. He also had, if the earth in that corner said what he thought it said, a responsibility that didn't care about any of those complications. Dale Morrow had never in his life walked away from a responsibility, even when it had cost him. Even when walking toward it had been the choice that broke everything else. He pulled out the burner phone he carried for emergencies, a prepaid flip phone with $12 of credit on it, and took photographs of the floor, the padlock, the door, the exterior of the barn. Then he walked back out into the cold and sat on a fallen fence post with Ranger pressed against his leg and thought for a long time. There was a town 7 miles east. He'd passed through it 2 days ago. Millhaven, Alabama. Population maybe 3,000. 1 sheriff's substation, a Dollar General, a diner. He'd bought coffee at the diner, and the woman behind the counter had given him an extra cup without being asked, which he'd noted, and which had made him like the town more than he would have otherwise. He thought about what he knew and what he didn't know. He knew the land was called Halverson. He knew the barn had been deliberately locked. He knew the earth in the corner had been disturbed and resettled, probably decades ago. He knew that the chemical smell he'd detected had the degraded signature of quicklime, which people used for 2 reasons: agriculture and concealment of organic decomposition. He didn't know who was buried there. He didn't know who had done it. He didn't know who owned this land now, or who had owned it then, or what the political landscape of Millhaven, Alabama looked like when it came to investigations of this nature. He thought about the padlock again. Old, but not rusted through. Someone had maintained it, or replaced it, not too many years ago, which meant someone knew this barn existed and had reasons to want it sealed. That changed things. Dale Morrow had spent 11 years in direct action operations. He knew what a surveillance-minded person looked like when they looked at a problem, and he was looking at one now. If someone was still maintaining that lock, They would notice when it was broken. And if they noticed, and if Dale had already called the county sheriff, there would be questions about timing, about who'd found what and when, about the chain of evidence. He needed more information before he made the call. That was the calculation. It wasn't fear. He'd operated in enough hostile environments that fear had become largely functional rather than paralyzing. It was operational logic. You don't call in the airstrike until you've confirmed the target. He put the phone in his pocket, shouldered his pack, and told Ranger to heel. They walked east toward Millhaven as the afternoon light went flat and gray. The county courthouse was not in Millhaven. It was in Dunnet, 12 miles north, and Dale walked there the following morning, arriving at 9:15 when the offices opened. He found the Register of Deeds on the second floor, and a woman named Beverly, who appeared to be in her late 60s, and who looked at Dale with a particular expression of someone who had seen most things and had opinions about all of them, but would help him anyway. He asked about the Halverson property on County Road 7. Beverly took 4 minutes with her records system and came back with a printout. The land had been owned by a man named Cletus Halverson until his death in 1987. It had passed to his son, Boyd Halverson, who had held it until 2003, when it was transferred, not sold, transferred, to a man named Kenneth Pruitt. Dale wrote the name down. He asked Beverly if Kenneth Pruitt was a local name. She looked at him for a moment before she answered. "That name is known around here," she said, not elaborating. The way people talk about a name they know not to elaborate on in a government building. Dale thanked her and left. He spent the rest of that morning doing what he could with limited resources. The diner had Wi-Fi. He ordered oatmeal he couldn't really afford and used the connection to search Kenneth Pruitt in Dunnet County, Alabama. What came back was thin but suggestive. Kenneth Pruitt had served as Dunnet County Sheriff from 1991 to 2007. He now ran a private security consulting firm based in Montgomery. He had a LinkedIn profile that listed him as a law enforcement and security professional. He had no criminal record. He had, at some point in 2003, received a piece of land from Boyd Halverson for a consideration amount listed in the deed as $1. $1, which was how you transferred property when the actual exchange wasn't something you wanted in the public record. Dale ate his oatmeal slowly and thought about a man who had been the county sheriff for 16 years, receiving a piece of land with an abandoned barn on it for $1 the year he left office. He thought about the padlock. He thought about the quicklime. He thought about Ranger sitting down in the far corner of that barn, with the patient certainty of an animal who knew exactly what he'd found. There was a local newspaper, the Dunnet County Courier, which had a website that hadn't been updated in 3 weeks, but had a searchable archive going back to 1994. Dale sat in the diner for 3 hours and worked through it systematically. He was looking for missing persons. He was looking for anything connected to the Halverson property. He was looking for the name Pruitt. What he found in an issue from September 1988 was a small article about a woman named Gwendolyn Tate, aged 31, who had been reported missing by her sister after failing to appear for a family event. The article was 4 paragraphs long. It noted that Gwendolyn had last been seen in the company of an unnamed individual, and that the Dunnet County Sheriff's Department was investigating. There was no follow-up article. He searched for her name across the entire archive and found nothing further. He noted that Cletus Halverson had died in 1987. He noted that Gwendolyn Tate had disappeared in 1988, the year after Halverson died and the year the property passed to Boyd Halverson. He noted that Kenneth Pruitt had joined the Sheriff's Department in 1989. He didn't know what any of it meant. He had pieces, not a picture, but the pieces were the wrong shape to be coincidence. Dale paid for his oatmeal and his 3 cups of coffee and walked outside where Ranger was tied to a post. and the dog looked at him with that expression, the one that was not quite patience and not quite urgency, but something in between. And Dale put a hand on the dog's broad head and stood in the cold for a minute. He was 53 years old. He had nothing to his name except a pack, a sleeping bag, a pry bar, and a dog who'd been trained by the United States military to find things that people had hidden. He had no standing, no credibility, no official status of any kind. He was precisely the kind of person that a system like the one he was beginning to understand would count on to be disregarded. He thought about that for a while. Then he thought about Gwendolyn Tate, who would be 67 years old if she were alive, and who had disappeared in 1988 and been mentioned in 4 paragraphs in a small-town newspaper and never mentioned again. He made a decision. He walked back to the Halverson barn that afternoon. Not to disturb anything. He had a reason now, and the reason required documentation that would hold up. He took photographs, careful, systematic, the way he'd documented sensitive sites during operations. The exterior, the padlock hasp and the pry marks he'd left on it. The interior, the far corner, the dimensions of the disturbed earth, which he measured with a length of cord and recorded in a small notebook he'd been using to track his walking route. Ranger went back to the corner and sat down again. The same posture, the same certainty. "I know," Dale told him. On his way out, he noticed something he'd missed the first time. On the interior wall near the door, at about shoulder height, someone had scratched letters into the wood. Crude, hurried, pressed hard into the grain, as if made by a key or a nail. He pointed his flashlight at it. GT. God sees. He stood there for a long time without moving. Then he walked back to town and used the last $9 on his burner phone to call the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency's tip line, not the county sheriff, specifically and deliberately not the county sheriff, and told them what he'd found and where, and gave them the name Gwendolyn Tate, and the name Kenneth Pruitt, and the date on the deed transfer, and the address of the barn and the photograph files, which he sent from the phone before the credit ran out. He didn't give them his name. He didn't have to. He had given them enough. He camped that night in the tree line 200 meters from the barn, because old habits are hard to break, and because he wanted to know. He wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to know. Whether someone would come to check the lock, maybe, or whether the state police would arrive first. He made a cold camp, no fire, and sat with his back against a pine, with Ranger across his legs for warmth, and watched the barn in the darkness. At 2 in the morning, headlights appeared on County Road 7. A pickup truck, moving slowly, without urgency. It turned down the farm road and stopped near the barn. One man got out. He was broad through the shoulders and moved with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room he was in. He went to the barn door, saw the broken hasp, stood there for a moment. Then he took out a phone. Dale watched him. Ranger was absolutely still. The man made a short call. Then he stood beside his truck for 11 minutes and then he drove away. Dale stayed where he was. He thought about moving. He thought about a lot of things. Ranger didn't move either. At 5:40 in the morning, 2 vehicles with state police markings came down the farm road, followed by a third vehicle that turned out to belong to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. They went into the barn with lights. They were there for 4 hours. Dale watched from the tree line until the sun was well up. Then he shouldered his pack, clicked his tongue for Ranger, and walked east along the road. He read about it 6 days later at a library in a town called Farlow, using one of the public computers. The state police had confirmed human remains at a property in Dunnett County. The investigation was ongoing. No other details had been released. 3 weeks after that, at another library in another town, he found a longer article. The remains had been identified through DNA comparison with a surviving family member. They were those of Gwendolyn Marie Tate, who had been 29 years old at the time of her disappearance in the fall of 1988. Not 31 as the original article had stated. The paper had gotten her age wrong, which was the kind of small, careless error that accumulated into a kind of erasure. A former county official had been named as a person of interest. The article did not specify who. It didn't need to. Dale sat back in the library chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Ranger was outside, tied to a bike rack, visible through the window. The dog was watching a sparrow with professional attentiveness, tracking its movement with small, precise shifts of his head. 36 years. Gwendolyn Tate had been in that ground for 36 years. The 4 paragraphs in the newspaper had been the last time anyone in any official capacity had publicly said her name. And the investigation that should have followed had been quietly set aside by the man who would later receive that piece of land for $1. Dale didn't know exactly what had happened to her. He might never know the full shape of it. What he knew was that she had scratched her initials and 3 words into a barn wall before the end, and that the barn had been locked, and the lock had been maintained, and the story had been allowed to become silence. He thought about what it meant that a man with no address and no ID and a retired military dog had been the one to find her. He didn't have a clean answer for that. The VA had lost his paperwork twice. The apartment was gone. The marriage was gone. 22 years of service had deposited him at 53 years old into a sleeping bag in a tree line, watching state police work a crime scene he'd found because his dog wouldn't stop circling a barn. He thought about the woman at the diner who had given him the extra coffee without being asked. He thought about Beverly at the Register of Deeds, who had looked at him with that particular expression, and then helped him anyway. He thought about Ranger on that cold floor, sitting in the corner with a patience that didn't require explanation or justification or documentation, a certainty that didn't negotiate with doubt. There were things that endured, he thought, things that stayed true regardless of what the paperwork said or didn't say. Ranger had known. And because Ranger had known, and because Dale had learned in the most thorough way possible to trust what the dog knew, a woman's name had been spoken aloud again after 36 years of silence. That wasn't nothing. He was certain of that much. He closed the browser window, pushed back the chair, and stood up. He rolled his shoulders, picked up his pack, and went outside into the thin December light. Ranger looked up from the sparrow immediately, as he always did when Dale came through a door, as if some part of him was always listening for that particular footfall, among all the others in the world. Dale unclipped the leash from the bike rack, and they walked north, toward no particular destination, the way they had been walking for 14 months. But something was different now, and he didn't try to name it exactly. It was something that sat in the chest differently than the weight he'd been carrying, less like a verdict and more like an opening, like a locked door that had been taken off its hinges, like light coming in through a gap that hadn't been there before. Ranger walked beside him, with his tail moving in that slow, deliberate way, and the morning was cold, and the road ahead was long, and Dale Morrow put one foot in front of the other and did not look back.